Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. This month, over 100 retired officials and civil society figures from India and Pakistan signed an open letter asking their governments to restore ties between India and Pakistan. Weeks before that, the RSS General Secretary said India should never shut the door on dialogue with Pakistan, and the RSS chief walked it back within days. One camp says never talk given Kargil, the parliament attack, Mumbai, Uri, Pahalgam. The other says permanent hostility with a nuclear neighbor isn't a strategy. It's a false binary. The real question is what kind of engagement is actually available, given how much has structurally changed since the last cycle of re-engagement. To unpack this today, we're joined by Aishwaria, research analyst for Pakistan studies at Takshashila. She works on counter-militancy, security, and the military political nexus in Pakistan. We're also joined by Raja, adjunct fellow leading West Asia studies at Takshashila, with over 2 decades in diplomacy and peace building, including UN peace mediation, and his research covers peace mediation and the climate security link. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Kavya.
Thanks, Kavya.
Aishwarya, your newsletter argues India's Pakistan policy shows more continuity than it's credited for. Territorial integrity, no internationalization of Kashmir, deterrence, avoiding full-scale war, held constant across governments while only the instruments change. What actually shifts between governments if not the objectives?
Thank you for the question, Kavya. I think it's useful to distinguish between strategic objectives and the instruments used to achieve them, which you already mentioned and I've extensively written about in Pakistan Paigam. India's strategic objectives have remained remarkably consistent across governments. Those haven't fundamentally changed from Vajpayee to Manmohan Singh or to the current Narendra Modi government. What has changed is the doctrine, the way India has sought to achieve these objectives. Under Prime Minister Vajpayee, the emphasis was on political outreach despite periods of conflict. We saw the Lahore Bus Yatra and the Agra Summit alongside military responses like Kargil. Similarly, under Dr. Manmohan Singh, there was greater emphasis on sustained institutional dialogue. We saw the composite dialogue, confidence building measures, cross LOC trade and travel opened up. And we also expanded economic linkages while exercising strategic restraint. The Manmohan Singh government had issued diplomatic protests. Pakistan was taken to global forums, FATF, UN, and all sorts of things. But since 2016, under Prime Minister Modi, the doctrine has shifted towards more of a calibrated military deterrence and diplomatic pressure. We saw that with surgical strikes, Balakot, Operation Sindoor, where the geographical scope of each of this retaliation was kind of extended from the line of the line of control to the international border and then deep into Punjab last year. The current government has downgraded diplomatic ties, suspended trade. They've placed the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance. And this all reflects a willingness to impose costs on Pakistan while reducing the scope for political engagement. So I think the objectives broadly remain similar. The instruments have evolved from dialogue and confidence building to diplomatic isolation and absolute disengagement. Now, how much of these policies have worked is a conversation that we can continue to have.
Right. Raja, you've worked on mediation extensively. When you look at the reported India-Pakistan track 2 rounds in Muscat, Doha, and Colombo over the past year, does that pattern look like genuine groundwork for something or the kind of low-stakes contact that mediation efforts maintain without ever intending to escalate into real negotiation?
Well, thank you, Kavya. I firstly don't think that this is anywhere close to it's not a mediation because there's no third party involved, and nor is it even a bilateral negotiation of sorts. The Indian Foreign Secretary said that such events that have actually, he said, do not hold much value, which I think is significant. Because track two, in my humble opinion, does hold a certain value. It's not something that has official state sanction. These track two dialogues that are between citizens of two sides, let's say, they actually enable plausible deniability for the state to say that, look, we are not engaged in negotiations, even as you try and feel the other side out. Uh, and But most importantly, I believe these kind of occasions, these kind of dialogues are important to humanize the enemy, or humanize, let's say, in fact, enemy is a strong word, adversary. Because what often happens, conflicts, is that we tend to, because there are always bad actors, on the other side, and then you tend to see the adversary as less than human at some point, and that's a risk. That's a problem. So these kind of dialogues, these kind of contacts, believe help humanize the adversary, and that in turn pays dividends for a peace process anytime in the future.
Right, right. So, Aishwarya, you argue Pakistan's military establishment has an institutional stake in keeping India cast as an existential threat. Field Marshal Asim Munir has just built a global profile, brokering the US Iran ceasefire. Does that change how central the India rivalry still is to the military's own legitimacy at home?
I think I would separate Pakistan's external diplomacy from its internal strategic narrative. Field Marshal Asim Munir's role in facilitating the US Iran ceasefire, if it translates into sustained diplomatic relevance, certainly enhances Pakistan's international profile. Today, we see, just recently, we heard that Pakistan is also negotiating in Libya. So it does reinforce Pakistan's long-standing ambition to position itself as a regional security interlocutor rather than, merely a recipient of international attention. But I think that fundamentally alters the centrality of India in the Pakistani military's worldview. So, for decades, the military has derived legitimacy not only from defending Pakistan against India, but also from, portraying itself as an indispensable guardian of the state. And that narrative is deeply embedded in Pakistan's security structure. In the force structure, we see that in procurement priorities and even in their political economy. For anyone interested, the military business, or as Aisha Siddiqa calls it, Milbis, it's a very interesting study on the Pakistani military's economic footprint in Pakistan. So, one successful diplomatic intervention, speaking of US and Iran, does not undo all these structural incentives. Um, However, that being said, I wouldn't reduce Pakistan's foreign policy to India alone. The military today has to manage multiple fronts simultaneously. There's Afghanistan, and then there are internal insurgencies of the TTP, the Baloch groups. They have to balance ties with Iran, which is another neighbor, while also sort of, balancing ties with two major players, US and China. They have to manage their Gulf partnerships. While it does all of this, it's also under severe economic constraints. So, in that sense, I think its strategic bandwidth is much broader than it was, let's say, 2 decades ago. And the real question is whether this expanded regional role eventually creates incentives for greater regional stability, including with India. But I think at the moment, the evidence is mixed. India's significance may fluctuate depending on the external environment, but for the years to come, it will continue to occupy a
Right.
central place in Pakistan's
Right.
strategic imagination.
Right. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about the current freeze that is ongoing, and there's no trade, no full diplomatic presence, no sports or cultural exchange, and tightened visas has lasted the better part of the decade. What makes it structurally different from the disengagement after Kargil or Mumbai? Both of which eventually cycle back towards re engagement. And Raja, I'd like you also to jump in here.
Yeah. So, just to put this into context, I think there are three important differences. I think the first is the depth of engagement is unprecedented. After Kargil or even 2611, despite diplomatic ties being severely downgraded, channels were eventually reopened. Trade continued, high commissioners returned to the respective capitals. Cricket was being played. We had Atif Aslam come and sing in India. So cultural exchanges did resume. And there was always this expectation that dialogue would restart at some point. Today, we have a near zero relationship. There's no trade, diplomatic representation remains downgraded, visa regimes are highly restrictive, and very similar things with sport and cultural exchanges, right? And political dialogue is virtually absent, although since Operation Sindhu, there have been about at least three or four track dialogues, but nothing on an official scale. Secondly, I think India's strategic thinking has changed. Earlier, the assumption was that maybe continued engagement with Pakistan would gradually moderate their behavior. But since 2016, since Uri, this policy has shifted towards just imposing costs through military responses, economic measures, and so on. The decision to place the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance after Pahalgam attack last year is also kind of part of that broader doctrinal shift. And third, I'll try to wrap it up really quickly, but the regional and international context is so different today than it was. India is a much larger economy, while Pakistan grapples with economic, political instability, multiple security challenges. At the same time, China has also emerged as a central challenge to India's foreign policy. So, Pakistan no longer occupies the same relative position. I mean, it is still significant, but I think there's a lot happening also in the region that is influencing all of these decisions. Having said that, I would really avoid concluding that this freeze is permanent. India Pakistan relations have repeatedly surprised us. History tells us that periods of prolonged hostility has often followed by some form of engagement. And although there's no engagement, we're at a time where there is some conversation around it. Um, but I personally believe even if engagement resumes, I don't think we should get stuck on, oh, should we talk to Pakistan or should we not talk to Pakistan into such binaries. But we should look at more technical issue specific than ambitious emotional peace processes that we've seen in the past. And I have thoughts on that, but again, I'll save that for another podcast.
Right. Raja, would you like to take?
Sure, Kavya, just that there is, as Aishwarya said, the regional context has changed. I think for a long time, India was looking at Pakistan through a bilateral lens. But from last year, from the time of Op Sindoor, I think it's very clear that India looks at China and Pakistan through a common lens. This is a very significant. This is highly significant in terms of how the strategic community in India, how the state in India looks at relations with Pakistan now. And in some ways, this could mean that at some point, the normalization of ties with Pakistan is in a way linked to the state of ties, of bilateral ties of India and China. This is it may not be explicitly linked as such, but there could be a tacit, even if somebody doesn't actually link it, it just might just transpire that way. Now, if you look at how, for example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor 2.0, as they're calling it, wherein the Pakistan's digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, surveillance architecture, so much of it is being built on Chinese platforms. We've already seen the role that Chinese platforms played in terms of Pakistan's military capacity during the Op Sindoor operations. So it's very, very clear that the two countries are militarily as well as technologically and perhaps strategically more linked today than ever before. And therefore, for India, it's no longer an issue of just negotiating with Pakistan, but having to address this linkage between China and Pakistan, and therefore having to look at it far more strategically than it has ever been looked at. And therefore, I am not very hopeful of a normalization of Pakistan anytime soon, honestly. I believe this is going to be far more complicated this time around than in the past. Also, we don't have any of the generation that was there at the time of partition. That generation is fast graying. We have a post independence generation that has far fewer emotional ties across the border, and therefore I think the hardline stance that might be taken on both sides of the border, by the way, this is true, by people on either side, it could be far stronger in this era than it has ever been before.
Right. So Aishwarya says that there is hope, but you think that we should not hold our breath.
I'm an optimist. What can I say?
I'm a cautious optimist.
So, just to pivot a little and look at climate and security, which is one of your core research areas, Raja, the World Bank projects Pakistan's GDP could fall 18 to 20% by 2050 from climate change and environmental degradation. Elsewhere, you've studied, has climate cooperation ever actually worked as a depoliticized track between hostile states, or does it get pulled into politics anyway once the stakes are visible?
So yes, climate is a common challenge for India and Pakistan. Climate change has become very acute. In fact, the projections that we have from IPCC etc. indicate that North India, Pakistan, and northeastern China are likely to be the parts of the world that are most acutely affected by climate change. We have seen in the course of the floods in Pakistan the kind of havoc that climate change can wreak on the region. There is fear even in North India, for example, in the north of India, that by 2050 we're going to look at 50 degrees centigrade temperatures, 85% humidity, which will make manual agriculture, quite manual farming will become really, really difficult. And it is expected to lead to large scale displacement inside the country. So both countries face this climate crisis. Now, there have been instances where India has worked in tandem with China when it came to international climate negotiations, multilateral climate negotiations, including in the run-up to Paris Accords. So there is some scope, some possibility that on multilateral platforms that related to, for example, climate justice, that involve the principles of climate justice, India and Pakistan could tactically cooperate. This may not lead to any long-term strategy in terms of jointly addressing climate change, which is frankly something that could be worked on, but there could be some tactical cooperation. I fear it will be limited to tactical cooperation, a very pragmatic cooperation on multilateral fora. But it should be something deeper. I do feel that the Himalayas are very crucial for the ecosystems of both countries. So therefore, more collaboration is perhaps, there's potential for far more collaboration when it comes to preserving this very precarious ecosystem.
Right. So this brings me to my last question on the domestic politics side. Aishwarya, how do you read the RSS General Secretary and Bhagwat episode? Is it a genuine trial balloon for the RSS that got pulled back, or a signal that was never meant to go anywhere?
I would be cautious about reading too much into one single statement. From the outside, it's difficult to know whether this was a trial balloon, an internal debate becoming public, or simply a comment that generated more political attention than anticipated. Also, this is not the first time Shashi Tharoor did write an op-ed in February. Then we had Ambassador Nirupama Rao batting for reopening engagement in the following months. But what is interesting, however, is not the intent, but the fact that the conversation happened at all. For nearly a decade, India's Pakistan debate was largely framed around accountability and terrorism and deterrence. So this RSS Mohan Bhagwat episode briefly kind of reopened that space to ask whether there is any room for limited engagement, but I wouldn't read much into it. Also, the subsequent clarification it came from the RSS is equally important. It was emphasized that Mohan Bhagwat was referring to people engagement and not an engagement with the political class of Pakistan. So I think that suggests there remains a distinction between advocating limited societal contact and advocating a broader diplomatic reset. Again, how there would be people to people contact was not mentioned because the current status is such that, like I said, and I keep coming back to Atif Aslam, but we don't have any cultural ties, we don't have sporting ties, we don't have religious visa regimes, only for Kartarpur corridor, but broadly it remains very restrictive. So even when you say people to people ties, that's very broad. We don't know what that means. And ultimately, I wouldn't treat these remarks as evidence of any eminent political shift. India's policy for Pakistan is driven by the government and shaped primarily by security considerations. The security centric approach will remain. But the episode does indicate that even within constituencies that were traditionally associated with the hard security approach, there is room to discuss what this long-term engagement relationship would look like. And again, I would be super cautious about equating any sort of engagement with political normalization. I think political normalization is steps ahead. And like Raja said, we have to be cautious of how we look at this optimism.
Right. Raja, what is your take on this?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a time of, it's an interesting time when we are reading the statements of not just, say, government actors, but also non-governmental actors and what they think about a diplomatic process. So I think while it's important to hear what everyone says. I think we should be guided by and large by what the state says, by what the government says, what MEA says, and I think we can even read between the lines when it comes to communiques. But I think beyond that, we should not read the tea leaves too much on what, say, civil society actors, irrespective of persuasion, say, because civil society actors can sometimes be they can be aspirational in what they want, and I think that's it's good to also know that. But in this particular relationship, it is not civil society that is in the driver's seat, and frankly, that goes for irrespective of how powerful the civil society actor is. The relationship is being driven by state actors, and therefore, I believe that the thaw, when it happens, will be one that happens between the governments. My colleague Pranay Kodastane has talked about three dimensions of bilateral ties: state to state, state to people, and people to people. In this particular relationship, I believe that it is the state to state relationship and not the people to people one that is crucial for a thaw.
Absolutely. So I think this was never really simply talks versus no talks. India's objectives have held steady across governments while the instruments shift, and Pakistan's military has its own institutional stake in how the relationship gets read. I'd like to thank Aishwarya and Raja for joining us today to give us a holistic view of this situation. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you to the listeners for listening in.
Thank you, Kavya.
Thank you, Kavya.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.